Welcome to New Testament Bible History. These introductory sessions are intended to sort of get us into the frame of mind to think more like the people of the first century were thinking by reviewing their history, looking at the political scene and their religious background in that day in which they lived, and now we'll try to get just an overview of their geographical situation. That'll help us to get closer to the first century and better understand what God wrote to us in that first century. Now, don't forget to have your class sheet available each session so you can fill out the blanks during this lesson. But before we start, let's read through our new historical outline, the abbreviated one, that's present at the front of the handbook. Now, these dates are our core anchor points upon which we'll build as we move through the New Testament. With the exception of the birth of Christ, these dates are precise dates set down solidly in history. So let's start with the first one, BC 5, Christ born. BC 4, Herod the Great died and his sons were invested. AD 14, Augustus Caesar is dead after a 43-year reign. AD 29, John the Baptist began preaching in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. AD 49, Claudius Caesar expels Jews from Rome. AD 62, James, the Jerusalem pastor, is stoned. AD 64, the Great Fire of Rome under Nero and the beginning of the first imperial persecution of Christians. AD 66, the Great Jewish Revolt erupted in Palestine. AD 68, the death of Emperor Nero. And AD 70, Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed by the Roman general Titus. AD 94, Domitian persecutes the Christians. And AD 96, Domitian is dead. Please open your handbook to Geography Introduction 3. Today's lesson requires a recognition of the following factors. First, Israel's location was strategic. When you look at Israel on the map, it's not a very big place. We must look at it in the wider context of its important neighbors. It was surrounded by large kingdoms to the east and to the south. These kingdoms were situated on large rivers which supported the development of great civilizations. Mesopotamia over in the east had its Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Egypt had its Nile River. Israel had no such resource. But what can be said for Israel is that it is the land between the big important neighbors. It was a literal land bridge where all the caravan routes passed, coming from the east or from the south, moving through Lebanon and Palestine. True, Israel did not have a river civilization, but it definitely was not an out-of-the-way place. It was truly right on the way to everywhere. Now, this location made Israel ideally situated to become a light to the Gentiles who passed through it, according to Isaiah 49:6. Bounded by desert on the east side, and this narrow strip of land, 60 miles or 96 kilometers wide, and 150 miles or 240 kilometers long. Along the Mediterranean Sea coast, it functioned as a bridge between the great river civilizations of the ancient world. It was also very important to the Romans, who could not afford to ignore the Jewish aspirations to throw off their Roman authority over the region. Rome would crush mercilessly the periodic Jewish revolts. The great Jewish revolt of AD 66 would move Rome to action, and Jerusalem and the great Herod's temple would be destroyed for good. Palestine was important to Rome's strategic interest, and rebellion would not be tolerated. Now, the second thing we need to note is that Israel had to depend on outside forces for an adequate water supply. It had no great river that ensured an abundant supply of water, as did the great kingdoms. It depended mainly on rain in the winter and on the Jordan River, that small river which gathered its waters mainly from the Lebanese mountains and partially from Syria. Israel is still at the mercy of its neighbors for water supply. This will always affect its economy and the quality of life. Its climate, with the temperature and seasonal changes in rainfall, will impact everyday life. Now, God is going to use its climate so that He can display His great works to them and teach them how to trust Him. Now, thirdly, its topography was designed by God. Its hills and its valleys and its streams and rivers and its rocks and its rills, the elevations and the soils are all planned to give the physical context that God needs for the events of the Scriptures to happen just the way He wants it to happen. The importance of noting these physical elements can be likened to like watching a Shakespearean play acted out in a dismal warehouse without any props or stage backdrops or without any furniture to complement and promote the occasion. We hear the Bible characters speak, and if we can just gain a little sense of the world and in which they were living and the issues to which they were responding, we can better follow them and better understand the plot and what's going on. Now, God designed the land of Israel as one grand stage upon which He would place His men and women of faith to act out their roles and to display to the world what true faith really is. Someone has said that God designed the set, wrote the script, and cast the actors. So to help us enter into and to participate more in this great drama of the ages, that will be the challenge as we study Bible geography and some related events today. Now, the fourth thing I'd like you to note is that a network of roads had developed through the centuries with important centers in strategic locations on the routes. Note the Way of the Sea, or the Via Maris, on the west, and the King's Highway on the east on our map. Then we'll put in the options just a little bit later. So note first of all the Way of the Sea, or the Via Maris, an international route, an international highway from Egypt. It followed the Mediterranean coastline. See it just come up along the side of Israel. The traveler could continue on through Lebanon along the coast. And this would probably be if his destination was Asia Minor and points west. Or more likely, he could turn inland on the Via Maris through a pass to Megiddo. Note Megiddo on the map there. And then move up to Hazor, where the road veered northeasterly and ascends the Golan Heights and heads on to Damascus and Mesopotamia or other points beyond. Or back at Megiddo, the traveler could take the northern connector, that is, from the Via Maris to the King's Highway, and he would continue eastward from Megiddo through the valley of Jezreel to Tiberias, then by the Sea of Galilee through Capernaum, cross the Jordan River, and go on up the high plateau to Ramoth Gilead, on that high plateau, and there he would connect with the King's Highway, which ran from the south to the north to Damascus. Now, number two, the King's Highway. Note it moved along the highlands of Edom, Moab, and Gilead, and Bashan, and it connected Ezion-Geber, or Elath, down on the Gulf of Aqaba on the south, up to Damascus on the north. The southern east-west connector between the King's Highway and the Way of the Sea, or Via Maris, extended from the Medeba Plain in Moab, going down through the Jordan Valley, follow it, going by Jericho, up to Gibeon and the Judean wilderness, and up through there to Gibeon, and to Beth Horon, on to the Way of the Sea, the Via Maris on the Mediterranean coast. Now, fifthly, note that the security of Israel's people depended very much on the situation of these kingdoms. Israel was an important strategic land bridge between these two worlds that were either trading with each other or they were fighting each other. It was a priority for them to keep Israel under their control, to maintain passage through this land. Now, passage involved entering one end of Palestine and exiting the other. That little narrow strip of land called Palestine was a valuable strategic location of that world in that time, and Israel's security rested in the main in the hands of outsiders, humanly speaking, of course, without taking God into consideration. So Israel's vulnerability at these many points was God designed to provide a testing ground for faith in God to display and to operate. Let's take a look at Egypt now. Having laid the foundation, we'll just move to the south of Israel, to the land of Egypt, for an overview of that important country that related in many ways to Israel. Traveling south, we pass through Gaza with the Negev desert to the left. Then we'll go through the top of the Sinai Peninsula on around the corner to Egypt. Egypt was mostly desert as well as Sinai, except for one glorious exception. The flooding of the Nile River constituted a rich, fertile, green delta that resembles a huge V formed by the Nile, which splits into two main rivers just above Cairo, with the top of the V reaching up to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this great Nile River sourced deep in Africa from the area of Lake Victoria, and it flowed north 6,700 kilometers, or about 4,200 miles, through Africa, Sudan, and Egypt. Every year the Nile flooded and brought fertile soil to spread over that long Nile Valley and delta, which meant life and vegetation with great prosperity. This gave birth to a strong nation of that day with a huge grain-producing economy. There was the Nile on which to ship the grain from that long field down to the sea to the great port of Alexandria that would connect with the outside world. Now, Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome, and thus especially important to the Romans. The Mediterranean Sea boasted many good ports, which were very busy during the navigation season. And Alexandria in Egypt was the chief port, since it was the outlet for the grain crop of Egypt. Alexandria had a world-famous lighthouse in that harbor, built in 270 BC. It consisted of three main sections. Two primary materials were used for the exterior, white marble and lead mortar to connect the joints. Enormous pieces of granite were used from Aswan's mines down in Egypt, and they brought them up and used them for columns inside this huge lighthouse. Augustus Caesar became emperor in BC 27, and unlike Mark Antony and Cleopatra, whom he defeated, they represented a feudalistic capitalism of the state. Augustus Caesar favored free enterprise and free market policies. Now, although this was generally promoted throughout the empire, Egypt remained an exception for the most part, and the reason was that Egypt had to have a special economic system in the eyes of Rome because she was responsible. She was giving the most of the grain to Rome, and so they just couldn't turn her loose. They kept her under their wing because she was their main source of grain. Now, maintenance of this supply was critical to Rome's survival politically, especially due to the policy of distributing free grain, or later bread, to all of its citizens living in the city of Rome. This policy began in BC 58, and by the time of Augustus Caesar, the number of Rome citizens on the bread dole fluctuated between 200,000 and 320,000 people. The emperor paid the cost of this dole out of his own pocket, as well as the cost of games for entertainment for Rome, principally from his personal holdings in Egypt, which were basically his possession. This preservation of uninterrupted grain flows from Egypt to Rome was therefore a major task for all the Roman emperors and an important base of power politically. In the beginning, the motivation had been to, just sort of smooth out the seasonal fluctuations in the price of grain more than it was to provide a subsidy. But later, it became a political must. It was like a carrot stick, and from there, an almost absolute political necessity, which remained until the end of the empire, hundreds of years later. Now, despite the free grain dole, the vast majority of Rome's grain supply still was channeled through the free market system, since the dole was not sufficient to live on, and many of Rome's inhabitants, like slaves and people who were not citizens, were not qualified for the dole. Consequently, there was a need for a large private market for grain. Therefore, it was a political issue of adopting policies that would ensure adequate grain supplies and prices at a level that wouldn't provoke social discontent and unrest. Because Rome was near the Mediterranean Sea, she was able to be supplied by ships from grain-producing areas around the Mediterranean. And Egypt, of course, was Rome's principal supplier and accounted for about at least a third of the city's total needs. And the balance of the grain came from other regions within the Mediterranean basin. Now, the Roman port of Ostia handled these imports, and its facilities were improved in AD 42. The excavations have revealed all of this. They've shown an office of over 60 different agencies involved in shipping and commerce of grain. A warehouse space was rented out, and grain was used as collateral for loans, very much like today. The fleet that brought grain to Rome was privately owned, and ship owners tended to be independents who carried cargoes either on their own accounts or on consignment. Now, the grain trade boasted an ingenious system of quality control. I like this. When vessels were loaded, samples were taken of the grain and placed in big pottery jars that were then sealed and placed in the custody of the guards who were accompanying the shipments. And then when the cargo reached its destination, the quality of the shipment was compared with that of the sample in the jars. Ingenious. The ships used on the main trade routes from Alexandria to Rome were 1,200 to 1,400 tons, and they travel an average speed of about 3 knots, a speed of 5 knots, or 100 miles, or 160 kilometers per day, was occasionally recorded. Now, the typical speed, I understand, of grain vessels in the modern era might be around 20 knots. Well, the Emperor Claudius was one time jostled about and shaken up by a mob that was protesting food shortages. This was AD 51, so he took special attention and gave care to ensure that merchants had adequate incentives to supply Rome with her grain. He guaranteed to cover any merchants' losses of grain caused by storms while the grain was in transit. He also gave some very special privileges to ship owners and shipbuilders, most notably if someone who was a non-Roman citizen built a ship and used it to bring grain to Rome for 6 years, he would be granted Roman citizenship. That was no small thing. Generally, merchants who handled the city's grain supplies were exempt from all forms of public service. They really encouraged this. It was so important. One can easily see that grain supply was a red-hot political issue in that world, and Rome used her grain policies in an efficient manner to promote goodwill and peace throughout the empire. At particular sensitive times, even Herod the Great in Palestine handed out free bread in Jerusalem to win the political favor of the people. Now, going back about 1,800 years beyond that, in Old Testament history, just remember that Egypt was the breadbasket of that part of the world as well. Wasn't it Joseph who gathered up grain in the 7 good years to make up for the coming famine? It most probably was not only Jacob and his family knocking on Egypt's door for grain. Probably nations would have been knocking on Egypt's door for grain in such a time as well. Well, the New Testament contact with Egypt would include the child Jesus being taken to Egypt to escape the wrath of a jealous Herod, according to Matthew 2:13, and a mention of people from Egypt who were present at the day of Pentecost, Acts 2:10. A less direct contact would be the Ethiopian eunuch who came from Ethiopia through Sudan and Egypt to worship the Lord at Jerusalem. But he found the true worship in the desert south of Gaza in Acts 8:26. He was on his way to Egypt and then on to Ethiopia. Sinai and Arabia, we'll just take a quick look at them. Let's cross the Suez Canal over into Sinai, that desert peninsula. Note this satellite picture of the border between Israel on the top, or the north, with a brownish color, and Sinai on the bottom or south with a lighter color. The brownish color shows vegetation as compared with the light color, which shows an arid barrenness of desert. The difference is Israel's irrigation and grazing practices, and it shows us how important is the water supply to Israel even today. Well, this may be the valley of Rephidim, where the children of Israel gathered before the mountain of Sinai. It's large enough to hold them. To the back of Mount Sinai is nestled this monastery built by Justinian in the 5th century AD. They even have a bush there that they claim is an offshoot of the burning bush that Moses saw just right in this area. Well, this view from the top is breathtaking in that rugged terrain. This is where God came down and gave the law to Moses. It probably hasn't changed a whole lot during these 3,500 years. Now, New Testament contacts with Mount Sinai, or this area, include Arabians who were present at Pentecost, in Acts 2:11. The second thing we might note is Paul's visit to Arabia. He mentions this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia in Galatians 4:25. Now, Paul may have been instructed by the Lord about the doctrinal implications of Messiah, his death, burial, and resurrection. Certainly Sinai would have been a dramatic place for the Lord to instruct Paul about law and grace in the new covenant of Christ's blood, for which he would become the eloquent apologist and spokesman. Paul mentions this visit to Arabia in Galatians 1:17 and also makes an allegorical comparison between the law and grace in Galatians 4. He compares Mount Sinai to the heavenly Jerusalem and Hagar with Sarah. Can't you just see Paul in this area and the Lord teaching him the real meaning of all of these things? Now for a quick look at Mesopotamia. We'll just move over east and north of Sinai to the east of Israel to the Fertile Crescent bounded by the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. This is where civilization began in the Garden of Eden. Both of those rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, have their sources high up in the Armenian mountains in what we would call today Turkey. Those rivers flow down from that area and bring life and vegetation with them. They flow southward by different routes, separately and separated at one point by as much as 450 miles or 720 kilometers. And in that day, they flowed into the Persian Gulf separately. Now, two ancient capitals of great kingdoms were built on these two rivers, on the Tigris, the Ashur, and later Nineveh, and today Baghdad. The Euphrates on the west provided a route for the travel of caravans to the west, skirting the desert to the north, and Babylon was built on its banks. Now, New Testament contacts with this area include the mention of people who were present at the day of Pentecost: Parthians and Medes and Elamites and the dwellers in Mesopotamia, Acts 2, verse 9. Also, we have the greetings from the church that is at Babylon in 1 Peter 5 and 13. Now, Babylon is also mentioned in the book of the Revelation in chapters 16, 17, and 18. But this is generally thought to be referring typically to a satanic creation of paganism and philosophy that will come to its apex in the time of the Antichrist. And then it'll come to its great fall at the end of the Great Tribulation. Well, it's generally thought that Babylon includes the paganism of Rome as well. There are a few scholars, however, who have suggested that old Babylon would be revived in the last days, and that the Babylon of the Revelation is connected with a literal rebuilt Babylon. They support this view from Old Testament prophecies in Isaiah and Jeremiah that seem, in their view, to require a literal rebuilding of Babylon before the prophecies of their destruction can be completely fulfilled. Well, that's just an idea. The modern kingdom of Jordan includes the Old Testament Edom, Moab, and Gilead. The Jordan River constitutes the shared border of both Israel and Jordan. There are well-preserved ruins of Roman temples and an amphitheater at Jerash or Gerasa in Jordan. Herod built here, and there are some substantial ruins remaining. A temple to Zeus, a temple to Artemis, streets and buildings still remain standing. A large theater. Herod wanted to Hellenize the people, and he tried to bring in the Greek and Roman customs and worldliness and entertainments to wean the Jews away from their biblical emphasis. While Petra, the city carved out of the rose red limestone, is out of old Edom or modern Jordan. That city can only be entered through a small passageway called the Siq. As you walk through or ride a horse or donkey, you can see towering red limestone cliffs on either side. Inside this circular area, it's ringed by these rose red cliffs, are carved homes, tombs, a large stadium, and many other impressive buildings. The Roman road inside this complex is still intact, along with some Roman pillars. It's a fascinating city of history. Now, there's been a widespread thought through the years that the wilderness or mountains to which Israel is urged to flee in Matthew 24:16 during the Great Tribulation, that it could be this mountain ring remote city of Petra. And they've even had mission projects to raise money to hide canned food provisions in these rock dwellings carved out of the rock cliffs so that the fleeing Israelites will have food during that time. Well, that mission project just may be a bit of misguided zeal. What do you think? Moving up to the north and east of Palestine are the countries of the Phoenicians, Lebanon, and Syria. Phoenicia connected with the northern border of Palestine and contained the excellent and famous harbors of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. Now, the Phoenicians gave us our alphabet, and they were a seafaring people who traded with the world. Now, the Romans built famous pagan temples in Baalbek in Lebanon, which have survived the centuries and are a tourist attraction today. Now, New Testament contacts with Lebanon begin with the ministry of Jesus to a Syro-Phoenician Greek woman with great faith in the area of Tyre and Sidon, according to Matthew chapter 15. Jesus traveled from Galilee up to Tyre, then up to Sidon, and then back down to Galilee. In Matthew 11:21, Jesus denounced Chorazin and Bethsaida and said that Tyre and Sidon, where he just visited, would have repented in sackcloth and ashes had they heard as much gospel as you folks heard. Well, people from Tyre and Sidon also traveled down to Galilee to hear Jesus to teach, according to Luke chapter 16, verse 17. In Acts 11:19, after the stoning of Stephen, persecuted saints fled to Phoenice or Lebanon. And during Paul's last trip to Jerusalem in Acts 21, he spent a week with the believers in Tyre. Now, as for New Testament contact with Syria, the two outstanding examples are Damascus in the story of Paul's conversion in Acts 9, with a street called Straight, where he went to the house of Ananias. We have a modern-day contact with the church in Damascus in the area of the street called Straight, pastored by a graduate of our Sydney Bible Baptist College. The other outstanding Syrian contact is Antioch of Syria, the home of the missionary church that sent Paul and his team on 3 missionary journeys, beginning in Acts 13. The name Palestine is derived from Philistia. Originally, this referred to the southwest portion of the land. As we have observed, Palestine is a small country, 150 miles or 240 kilometers long from north to south, and 60 miles or 96 kilometers wide east to west. All the fighting of the centuries has been over a very small but important piece of real estate. Its better harbors, though not of the caliber of Lebanon's natural harbors, were starting in the south, Ashkelon near Gaza, going north to Joppa by Tel Aviv, and then on north again to the port of Dor, just south of Carmel. There's an interesting archaeological remains there of that maritime center. As you can notice, a slip ramp to pull up the boats, still visible in the rocks. A number of anchors have been found from the period. Then a bit north yet of Carmel is Akko, another port. Now, looking at a physical topographical map, a feature that stands out is the Jordan Rift. This rift isn't about a disagreement, but about a large rift or depression in the topography of the land. It extends from the top of Israel down to the Gulf of Aqaba and Eilat on the Red Sea in the south. Now, it reached its lowest point in the Dead Sea, 1,200 feet, or 365 meters below sea level. Double that to reach the bottom of the Dead Sea. This is the deepest land depression below sea level on planet Earth. Check it out, I did. This deep fissure is about 10 miles or 16 kilometers in width, with the Jordan River just right in the middle of it. The Jordan River has its sources in the foothills of the Lebanese mountains, specifically at Mount Hermon on the southern border of Lebanon and southwest border of Syria. The Jordan starts there at an altitude of about 300 feet or 100 meters above sea level, and that is the area up there of the excavation of the old city of Dan, where Jeroboam erected an altar along with Bethel to preserve his political power in the northern kingdom of Israel. Many important ruins have been excavated in Dan, including Jeroboam's altar. Now, nearby is Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus established his church with Peter as a founding member, the first stone among many more to come. Philip, the son of Herod the Great, ruled here and built a huge temple in honor of Augustus Caesar. Here are some of the ruins of that area. Mount Hermon is also near Caesarea Philippi and may be the mountain of Transfiguration. Well, other small tributaries of water join the Jordan River at what was Lake Hula. It was later drained by the Israelis in 1957. They drained these marshes and made a productive area for agriculture in them. Then you have the Jordan just flowing on 10 miles or 16 kilometers to the Sea of Galilee, which is also called Gennesaret, Chinnereth, or Tiberias. It drops to an altitude of about 630 feet or 192 meters below sea level, and you double that for the bottom of the Sea of Galilee as well. Well, the Sea of Galilee is a freshwater lake. It's ringed on either side by mountains, more like a high plateau, which makes it a beautiful place. New Testament contacts with the Sea of Galilee are just innumerable. Bethsaida on its shores was a home of Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Capernaum also on its shores was the home of Matthew, of Peter and his mother-in-law, probably after his marriage. And Jesus made Capernaum his headquarters for a time at the beginning of his ministry. And he preached in the synagogue and he performed miracles in that synagogue. Jesus met the disciples after his resurrection at the Sea of Galilee, according to John 21. The Jordan River feeds into the Sea of Galilee on the north, then it flows out of it on the south. It snakes its way down that Jordan Valley, called the Jordan Rift, until it enters the Dead Sea, east and slightly south of Jericho. Now, New Testament contacts with the type-rich Jordan River are significant, beginning with John the Baptist baptizing the multitudes, and later baptizing Jesus. There John pointed him out as the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world, John 1:29. The traditional place of Christ's baptism is near Jericho. The tourist site seen here seems so serene and so beautiful, just lovely to see it. Now the Dead Sea, the Jordan River dumps all its waters into the Dead Sea, but the Dead Sea gives out nothing. It's truly the Dead Sea. It has no outlet. Some wonderful lessons there. Though no contact is mentioned in the New Testament with the Dead Sea, it is mentioned that Jesus went to Jericho, which is just right near it. It was at Jericho that the blind Bartimaeus got his sight, met Jesus there. Zacchaeus, the tax collector, was saved there. Luke 19, and the Good Samaritan was just waylaid on his way down to Jericho. Well, note the divisions of Palestine in Old Testament times. Palestine was made up of three big blocks. Galilee in the north was a higher mountainous area separated from the next block to the south by the Esdraelon Valley, also called the Valley of Jezreel or Megiddo. And this valley extends from Mount Carmel on the Mediterranean diagonally to the southeast across Palestine toward the Jordan River. the range of the highest Lebanese mountains as they come down into Palestine, get lower, and continue to dwindle in height as they go southward. Now the valley of Jezreel, known also as the valley of Esdraelon or the valley of Megiddo, is rich in history. Megiddo is located a very strategic pass for the trade routes and commanded the access to this historic valley that's associated with Bible prophecy. Several battles took place there. The greatest battle of all is yet to happen, the Battle of Armageddon. And Nazareth was on a high ridge just overlooking the north side of that historic valley. And it must have been a common sight for Jesus to contemplate during his pre-ministry years, knowing the tragedy and the bloodshed that would someday be enacted in that very valley. Now Samaria is in the center, the middle block of Palestine. It has Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where the children of Israel came at one time and shouted the curses and blessings back and forth. Well, Samaria was unclean to the Jews, and even the dust of Samaria would defile a Jew. The two important contacts we'd like to mention with the New Testament, one was Jesus and the woman at the well of Samaria, Jacob's well in Sychar or Shechem in John chapter 4. Another interesting contact was when the Samaritans would not receive Jesus and his disciples because they were traveling south through Samaria on their way to Jerusalem. And they didn't like that. Well, James and John took it to heart. They didn't like the insult. And they asked Jesus, can we just call down fire from heaven and consume these hostile, unhospitable Samaritans? I wonder how many would have been killed had Jesus let them do it. Well, the southern block was Judah, of course, with Jerusalem and its environs, along with Bethlehem and Jericho, all very prominent locations for the birth and ministry of Christ, as well as the beginning of church history after Pentecost. Now, New Testament times under the Romans basically maintained these divisions. Just the area east of the Jordan River was called Perea, which meant beyond the Jordan. So if we would transpose the New Testament divisions over the Old Testament divisions, the main difference would just be the area across the Jordan on the east called Perea. Now we will have some map exercises from time to time. You'll find it in the road map. It'll inform you when you need to do it. It'll be an informative and beneficial exercise for you. At this point, let's look at some of the achievements of Herod the Great, that great figure in the New Testament. Well, the Faith Lesson series, that the world may know, talk about living in the shadow of Herod. It is helpful to gain a feeling of the atmosphere of the New Testament Palestine, just to take a discerning look at Herod and what he did. He was an absolute despot, but his accomplishments are almost unbelievable and help to explain why he had the influence that he had. Now, Herod had complete authority and he used it ruthlessly. He established an enormous secret police force, brutally killed anyone suspected of plotting against him, and created Roman peace by slaughtering all the dissidents. He was a tough customer. Well, Herod controlled the priesthood by placing a puppet whom he could manipulate into the position of high priest, and if any of his appointees dared to displease him, he disposed of them in no short term, and he replaced him with another pawn. Now, Herod was a great builder, but unfortunately he accomplished these mammoth building projects mainly through the use of slave labor, thousands of Jews to move enormous blocks of limestone that often weighed more than 10 tons each. His despotic actions caused the Jews to both despise him but also to fear him. Even projects that he commissioned, like the temple, to endear himself to the people, failed to change their hatred for him. The vast majority of popular tourist sites today in present-day Israel were originally built by Herod. Herod was very, very conscious of security issues, even to the point of paranoia. He built or rebuilt 11 fortresses throughout the land, just in case he might ever need them, find sanctuary there. These include Sebastia in the hills of Ephraim, or Samaria in the north, the central region of Israel. In particular, I'd like to note with you 3 fortresses, each of which is architecturally unique and have survived with noticeable ruins. The first one is Machaerus in Old Moab, or the New Testament area of Perea. The name meant the Black Fortress, and it was located on the frontier of Arabia about 9 miles or 15 kilometers east of and at an elevation of 3,860 feet or 1,176 meters, just above the Dead Sea on the north end of the Dead Sea. Originally it was built by the Maccabees, but was destroyed by the Roman forces under Pompey, the Roman general, but later Herod rebuilt it, and it served to guard the eastern frontier of Palestine from the marauding bands of Arab tribes in the south. And it was here that John the Baptist was beheaded by Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was a son of Herod the Great, and here are the ruins of some of that great fortress. The word Masada is Hebrew for fortress or stronghold. It was located near the west shore of the Dead Sea. Herod built this amazing mountaintop fortress mainly for a refuge for himself, should he ever need it, as well as wintertime enjoyment. Now Masada sits on a mountaintop 1,500 feet or 470 meters above the surface of the Dead Sea. The snake path up to Masada ascends 900 feet or 280 meters in elevation, and the fortress palace has 15 long storerooms for food provisions and weapons in times of siege. You can see them here. It's all been excavated. Well, Herod had several elaborate Roman bath houses with steam, heat, and you can see they've tried to reconstruct it there. Adequate water supply had to be secured because this is an arid region, not much rain. So he dammed up the little valleys around Masada to divert the winter rain water into cisterns, and then slaves carried the water up to the top of Masada, up to the top of that mountain. Again, Jewish rebels constructed a synagogue within the complex. A Roman force of about 9,000 soldiers, plus many support personnel and slaves, besieged the Jewish zealots that were holed up there after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. The Romans then built a wall 6 feet thick, 1.82 meters thick, and 7 miles or 11 kilometers around, surrounding the mountain so that no one could escape. Then the Romans built a siege ramp at the back of Masada to get to the top wall so they could bring their large ramming machines that would break through the top wall of Masada. Well, when they got it up there and succeeded, the 967 men, women, and children had agreed to kill each other rather than fall into the hands of the Romans and become slaves. Well, they did this on April the 15th, AD 73, and that was the end of the Great Jewish Revolt. Now, the Romans found all dead corpses inside except for a couple of women and 5 children who had managed to escape the mass suicide. Now, this event has become, rightly or wrongly, because Josephus, the historian, said that these fellows, these zealots, were more about themselves than they were about loyalty to the country and what other people was best for them. Anyway, this has become a great event in the life of Israel, is showing the loyalty to the country, the people who paid a supreme example of sacrifice for their country. So recruits from the Israeli Armored Corps go up to Masada and take the oath of allegiance on the top of that place. The third fortress we'd like to look at is Herodium, just 3 miles or 4.8 kilometers southeast of Bethlehem and 8 miles or 13 kilometers south of Jerusalem. It was close enough to Jerusalem for Herod to quickly flee there for security if he needed to. It was also a luxurious palace for Herod's enjoyment. For whatever reason, it was always a reminder to the Jews of the overwhelming power of Herod. He was just looking over their shoulders, and they were afraid of him. The mountain Herod had chosen for the fortress was too low, so he had his architects raise the summit by constructing a double-walled cylinder 200 feet wide, 61 meters across, and building his 7-story palace inside that cone. And then they had a massive fill of dirt and gravel put around the cylinder and formed the cone of this mountain. The ruins show a Jewish synagogue constructed by Jewish rebels out of Herod's dining room when they took over the fortress in AD 70 during the Great Jewish Revolt. The next building accomplishment we'd like to note is the temple. Herod considered himself a Jew, though he was of Edomite ancestry. He was a phenomenal builder, but he dreamed of making a magnificent and beautiful temple to rival that of Solomon's temple. This would be his crowning achievement, and he believed that he'd just create an everlasting monument to his memory if he could build this temple. Well, he made a speech announcing his unbelievable intention, and after, with great difficulty, convincing the Jews that he would not pull down the old temple until all was ready for the erection of the new temple. It began in 20 BC and was not finally completed until AD 65, just 5 years before Titus, the Roman general, would destroy it. These reconstructions of how that temple may have looked are probably weak representations of its truly great glory. Now, although Herod was a terrible tyrant, his building and his fortresses remain awesome architectural wonders even today. Caesarea, with its port, was probably Herod's most ambitious building project against such technical odds and difficulties. Caesarea is on the northern end of the Sharon Plain, midway between Tel Aviv and Haifa. Caesarea was given to Herod by Augustus in 30 BC, and construction was begun by Herod in 22 BC. The city was named after Augustus Caesar because Augustus Caesar had helped make Herod what he was. Well, the great port city of Caesarea was a product, someone has said, of the genius of Herod the Great. He created this fabulous city from its magnificent theater, amphitheater, palace with almost Olympic-sized swimming pool, the magnificent port, an aqueduct to bring fresh water, even to the sewer system. It was unusual. It was a wonder. The Herculean effort took over a decade, 10 years before completion in BC 9, and no expense was spared in its construction. Caesarea was an expensive political act to please the Emperor Augustus Caesar. Now, not only so, Caesarea was a very important place to Palestine economically. The city covered 170 acres and had a population of 100,000 in Herod's day, which was larger than Jerusalem. The Caesarean theater was built by Herod and is apparently the oldest of all Roman theaters in Israel. It held 3,500 to 4,000 people. Now, Herod displayed here, as nowhere else, the innate grandeur of his character. He triumphed over stubborn nature. He struggled with the difficulties so successfully that the solidity of his building defied the sea, while its beauty was such as if he had had no problem doing it. That's what Josephus said. Well, Herod's builders made a special concrete mixture which could be poured and yet hardened underwater. To keep the harbor silt-free, Herod designed a sluice system that allowed the water into the harbor basin while the continuous current flushed out the existing silt. Even the water currents flushed out the sewer systems on a regular basis. After Herod the Great's death, Caesarea became the main port and the administrative capital of the Roman province. It became the official residence of the Roman governors, including that of Pilate. Caesarea had several contacts with the New Testament. You remember Philip the Evangelist came here in Acts 8 after baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch. Paul visited Philip and his daughters here years later in Acts 21. Peter visited the Roman centurion Cornelius in Acts 10. Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great, died here in Acts 12 in the great theater that his grandfather built. Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea for 2 years and had audiences with Felix, Festus, and Agrippa II, the great-grandson of Herod the Great. Paul departed to Rome from Caesarea. Caesarea had a large number of Gentiles, and the tensions between them and the Jews sparked the Great Jewish Revolt in 66 AD. At that time, 20,000 Jews were killed and others became prisoners. Though Jerusalem was eventually destroyed in 70 AD to put down the revolt, Caesarea remained, and it remained the headquarters for the Roman military forces. This interesting inscription in mosaic was found in Caesarea from the imperial governor's tax department office, and it was from Romans 13:3. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. Lastly today, we'll note the climate of Palestine. The seasons in Palestine are divided by their relationship to rain. The rainy season is only winter. The dry season is in the summer. There is not a drop of rain in the summertime. This is true of the eastern Mediterranean countries and is due to the Mediterranean water currents. In our summer camps in Lebanon, we knew there would be no rain in the summer. Winter starts about October and ends about April, and rain will come during that time if it comes at all. And snow will also come, of course, on the higher elevations at the same time. Towards the mountains, Jerusalem has its winter snows. Rarely does snow fall on the coastline. So the summers, dry as a bone, depend on the springs of water that feed from the high mountains, which replenish the reservoirs of the deep from their snow and rain in the winter. The snows melt and soak down into the earth to fill these underground caverns and reservoirs. That is very important, since irrigation will maintain the orchards and other agricultural endeavors during the dry time, the summertime. The Jordan River depends upon these mountains and springs and is absolutely vital to Palestine's prosperity. When reading in the Bible about the miracle of rain in Samuel's time, it was perceived to be a miracle because it happened in a time when rain would not come naturally. Note the maps detailing the amount of rainfall in the different areas and the corresponding detail of vegetation. Notice that much of the land is brown, which means desert, like in little vegetation. The pale green denotes grassland. The psalmist said, "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof." Palestine is where God chose to put His people of old, to bring from them Messiah the Savior of the world. The fact that Jesus lived in that land and walked on it for 33 years doesn't necessarily make it holy in the sense that the world thinks holy, but it was a land separated, set apart, especially for a special task, and is significant and important to us who love the Lord and love His Word for that very reason. Well, the roadmap is your key to understanding what is required for your next class session. Check it at the front of your handbook and prepare accordingly May God bless you with a good week. See you next session, God willing.